Good morning, everyone. We apologize for the delay. We experienced a number of technical difficulties this morning, but I think we've got them worked out and we're ready to press ahead. Thank you for waiting. We appreciate all of your patience. In any case, I want to give a special welcome for today's Beasley Allen webinar, The Plain Truth, Finding Liability in Aviation Crashes. My name is David Byrne, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this important litigation topic, my partner, Mike Andrews. Today, Mike is going to discuss the aviation crash cases that he's handled, including the Boeing 737 MAX litigation. Mike will address the challenges of finding liability in these complex cases, and he'll share his thoughts on how to maximize client compensation in aviation crash cases. Now, while we're waiting on the last of our registrants to join us, let's take a few moments to meet our guest speaker. So my partner, Mike Andrews, is a longtime member of Beasley Allen's personal injury and product liability section. Mike and his team head up the firm's aviation litigation practice, where some of their notable cases have focused on the Marine Corps' MV-22 Osprey, the Cessna P-210N, and of course, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft. Mike has been named by the National Trial Lawyers to the top 10 aviation attorneys list for the United States, and he's the current president of the Alabama Head Injury Foundation. Mike is a fantastic attorney, and I couldn't ask for a more knowledgeable person to talk with you today about aviation litigation. Before I turn the program over to Mike, I need to go over just a few CLE-related notes. First, today's webinar has been approved by the Alabama and Georgia State Bars for 1 hour of CLE credit. In order to receive full credit for attending, you must stay on for the duration of the program. A link to today's presentation was included in the Zoom confirmation email you should have received when you registered. But by the end of this week, you'll receive another email with a certificate of attendance, an evaluation form, and an updated presentation and video link. You can email that completed evaluation form to webinars@beasleyallen.com. Today's webinar is being recorded. And for those Alabama and Georgia attorneys participating by phone, please email us your name, phone number, and state bar ID number to webinars@beasleyallen.com to ensure you receive full credit. For those of you practicing in other states besides Alabama and Georgia, we're going to send you a certificate of attendance that you can then present to your own state bar. Finally, if you have questions during today's webinar, I want to encourage you to use the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your screen. We're going to set aside time at the end of Mike's program today to try and tackle the questions submitted by our viewers. So with that, Mike, let's go ahead and get started.
Good morning, and thank you, David. I appreciate you having me here today, and folks, thank you for joining in to get some CLE credits here toward the end of the year. I hope that you find today's discussion interesting and meaningful and helpful to you in your practice. I think I'll apologize again for the technical issues that we had getting started, but it sort of ties in with some of the things we're going to talk about today. Have you ever had a computer that never crashed or that never had technical issues? Have you ever had a computer that worked properly every single time? Well, of course not, because that's not the way life works. That's not the way the real world works. It's not the way computers work. The more complex aircraft become, and the more complex the task that they are asked to perform, the computers run a greater risk of failing. And it becomes that much more important to have redundant systems, to have proper testing, to have proper oversight, and proper certification. And all of those things play a role in a number of crashes that we're seeing, including the 737 MAX crash. So again, I apologize for that. Thankfully, we didn't have a real crash this morning, though. So let's get started talking about it. As David told you, for a number of years now, I've handled aviation cases for our firm. And aviation cases obviously occur all over the world. So for the last 20 or 25 years, I've been involved in aviation mishaps in the U.S. and abroad. We've investigated cases that occurred on the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. I've had cases that occurred in the outback of Alaska. Sometimes we've looked at cases down south of the border. And of course, in the 737 MAX litigation, the crash occurred in Ethiopia in a sort of an isolated, desolate area outside of Addis Ababa, which is the capital, on a flight that was headed down to Nairobi. And the flight is only supposed to be about a 55 or so minute flight. During the course of handling this litigation, I've made that flight a number of times back and forth down for meetings and as part of the investigation. Unfortunately, that flight only lasted about 6 minutes, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But let's talk about one of the principles of aviation that you need to know when you're looking at an aviation case. And the easiest way for me over the years when I've taught CLEs and webinars is to actually tie it to specific cases rather than just academic principles and concepts. And so a real simple way to look at and think about aeronautic principles is with a paper airplane. Everybody has made or folded a paper airplane at some point. And so intuitively, if you've ever made one and thrown one of these, you get a lot of the aeronautic principles that the major manufacturers and designers have to take into account. You know, when you fold a paper airplane, that where you fold the wings and how you fold the wings make a difference on how the plane is going to fly. For example, if I were to bend one of these tail pieces up or bend the front down, it makes a difference on whether it's going to fly or not and how it's going to fly. One of the things that you also know, and you don't know that you know it yet, is where you hold the airplane before you begin to throw it makes a difference how the plane is going to fly. What you're doing is you're affecting the center of gravity, you're affecting the thrust, you're affecting the thrust point. For example, if you tried to throw the plane from here, it's going to have a very different flight profile than if you try to throw it from here. You just intuitively know to hold the plane about the middle, which corresponds generally with the center of gravity, which is very important for flight. And you know to throw it in a direction to keep the pointy end going where you want to go. Well, these are aeronautic principles. These are complex aeronautic principles, but they're intuitive just through a child's paper airplane. And we'll talk about some of that in just a few minutes. David mentioned to you the MV-22 or the V-22, sometimes known as an Osprey aircraft. I've got a couple of models here that I'll show you today. This is one of the models. This is an MV. This is the Marine version of the V-22 Osprey aircraft, and it is what's known as a tilt rotor aircraft. These have also been featured in the Transformers movies and a number of other movies. They're cool looking planes to look at. These are awful. These are horrible, dangerous, defective, flawed in so many different ways. These planes, crash over land, over sea. They crash when they're trying to land on a ship. They crash when they're trying to land in a parking lot. They can't fly in sand. They have difficulties in every operational environment that they're intended to fly in. But because it's a political animal, it's continued and it's been protected by various politicians. But the way these planes work, if you'll notice, the wings are fixed. The wings don't move, but the engines rotate on the ends of the wings. And so this gives it vertical takeoff and landing capability. You take off essentially like a helicopter, and in flight, it transitions so that the engines rotate forward. All right. Well, this need came about and was recognized by the armed services sometime back during the Vietnam era. And they wanted a greater capacity carrying piece of equipment, a helicopter replacement, but greater forward speed. And helicopters generally are limited how fast they can fly forward, limited by the speed of the main rotor blade tip. So to achieve greater forward speed and greater lift, the manufacturers pitched this idea. It's a bigger fuselage. It's got wings for lift and can locate, can fly, and take off and land vertically. Well, we were asked back in the very early 2000s to look at a crash that occurred in North Carolina, and we got involved. The planes mostly are composite materials, and so on a crash, these catch fire and burn, and there's really very few components left after a crash and fire because everything burns. A lot of the composite materials just simply are consumed in the fire. But we were able to get our hands, as part of the investigation, on the government's black box data, and it's called a black box. Obviously, they're not really black boxes. In fact, a black box for an airplane looks something like this. Now, the one in the V-22 looks different because it's a government model, and they all do something different. But a black box is a big orange thing, and it's orange, so it's easier for rescuers to locate this when they're combing through the pieces of a wreckage. And the data is written in here in a number of ways. Sometimes it's written on a wire or by a wire, using the kind of technology that phonographs used to use, when they were first invented. But it's protected and hardened so that you can come get things like the cockpit voice recorder, if it's there, and the flight data recorder. And those give you the different channels of information. Well, we use that information and we piece together what happened in this crash. The crash in North Carolina, in the early 2000s, the unit that was flying these planes in North Carolina was the most advanced in the military at that time for this piece of equipment. They weren't completely rolled out to the whole military yet, and so they specifically trained a unit, a group of guys, and they were literally the best of the best. These guys were flying along and experienced a catastrophic hydraulic failure in one of the lines that runs out to the engine that rotates at the end of the wing. See, you want to have redundant systems, because if you have a computer failure, if you have a hardware failure, you want to have a backup or redundant system to kick in, because you don't have, oftentimes, particularly in combat, you don't have a lot of spare time. You don't have time to troubleshoot and figure out what may be happening. So you want to be able to switch over either manually or automatically to a backup system. Well, the system that initially failed on the Osprey in the North Carolina crash was a hydraulic failure. You see, because you need to have the rotating of the engines, because you need to be able to control the flaps, the rear door, there are tons of hydraulics on these planes. And hydraulics just work off of pressure. You've got a pump and it injects hydraulic fluid into a line. You can open a valve remotely and it causes something to move. Well, right from the start, the manufacturers realized this piece of equipment could not carry the load that they wanted it to carry. And so they began to trim down weight. They began to cut weight out of it. And they said, well, one of the ways we can cut it out is that there are gallons and gallons of hydraulic fluid in this aircraft. So let's somehow reduce the amount of fluid that it has to have to fly. Here's what they did. They cut the size of the hydraulic lines down to really, really small, but to compensate for the reduced hydraulic fluid, they jacked the pressure way up. So it's super, super high pressure, small diameter lines, and the hydraulic fluid is operating at really high pressure. Now, if it all stays connected and you don't have a problem, generally that's okay. The problem is that the titanium lines in the Osprey aircraft are super strong to hold that pressure, but they're really, really brittle. There's a trade-off there. And so when the engines begin to rotate, the vibrational forces, see, helicopters obviously vibrate, right? And so the V-22 Osprey goes through a cycle of different types of vibrations. In the helicopter mode, it vibrates in a certain way, but then as it again begins to rotate and transition over, all of those oscillations and vibrations change, and it vibrates different parts of the aircraft. In this crash, it vibrated wiring bundles, big bundles of wire that run through the part of the airplane against the hydraulic lines, and it chafed and caused a rupture in the line. Well, you say, well, if you have a redundant hydraulic system, then it doesn't matter, right? Here's another problem. Where they transitioned the hydraulic lines from the wing into the engine, into the rotating part, there were 3 systems. They took them down to 1 line as it went through. So instead of having redundant backup systems with multiple backups, you have 1 system with multiple branches. And of course, the failure occurs there in that one spot. It instantly blew out all of the hydraulic fluid in a big cloud, and they lost control of that rotating engine. Military's big on rote memorization. And so pilots and anybody else in the military is trained, if you have a certain failure, here's what you automatically do. Here's instantly. You don't have to think about it. It's sort of a muscle memory thing. These guys have been trained to always push the primary flight control system reset button, PFCS reset, if you have a hydraulic failure. So they're flying, they get a warning light, and they automatically push the PFCS. This starts the second cascade of failures, which was in the software system. Because what happened is when they reset the system, it says, okay, well, let's first of all figure out where this engine is pointed and how it's oriented and what it's doing. It takes a snapshot of that and it says, all right, let's reset everything relative to that. So the first time they reset it, it might have been at this angle. The next time they reset it, it made it worse and made it worse and made it worse. So this became a very short, very violent crash, and all 4 crew members were killed. We were able to go through and deal with something that's a major defense in all of the government cases, and that's the government contractor's defense. The government contractor defense exists because the thought process is, look, if the government hires a contractor to build a piece of equipment, and they give you the specifications and they want you to build it just this way to do just this task, and there's a failure in that, then the contractor should enjoy some degree of immunity from liability. If the government says this is what we want and you build just that, how can the contractor be responsible? There's a whole line of cases, and it becomes a fairly complex area of law. But some of the seminal cases come from a body known as Boyle versus United Technologies. And essentially what you get are 3 main checkpoints that you look at. You say, look, in order for the contractor to enjoy immunity, you need to look at 3 things. Were there reasonably precise specifications for the piece of equipment, whether it's a tank or a machine gun or a stove in a camp somewhere, or in this case, an aircraft? Were they reasonably precise specifications? And then number 2, did the piece of equipment conform to those specs? Now, you would think those are simple. Those are simple questions. Either there were plans or there weren't. It either conformed or it wasn't. There's so many exceptions to that, and so many ways that those things can be argued and construed and twisted. And then finally, was the government as aware of hazards with this design that the manufacturer was aware of? That's a huge area. And it touches on so many issues in government contracts and in government aviation contracts, because you have this revolving door between retiring military members and folks who are going to come into a new job at, say, Lockheed or Boeing or Bell or wherever the contractor is. And so there's this constant communication, this constant flow of personnel. But what the law says is, was everyone up to speed? Did all parties here understand the hazards that were associated with this piece of equipment before they signed off on it? If the contractor can satisfy all 3 components of this test, there were reasonably precise specifications. the piece of equipment adhered to those specs. And everyone was on the same page. Literally, there was give and take. There was negotiation during the process of building this. Then, generally speaking, the contractor is going to be immune. In our case, we were able to show that in the early days, there were not reasonably precise specs. It certainly did not adhere to the specs for the aircraft. And there were a number of tests that may or may not have been shared with everyone, with all the players there. As a result of navigating the accident reconstruction, interpreting the data, putting together the flight profile, and then working through the complexities of the government contractor defense, we were able to successfully settle that case on behalf of the widow of the crew chief. This was a 4-man crew. Again, it's an awful piece of equipment. It's a political animal. At some point, there will be a replacement for this aircraft. We've had a number of other cases with mixed success because each component in each development piece of the aircraft goes through different development cycles, and there are different contractors and subcontractors, and there are different plans. And the manufacturers become more sophisticated with what documents they produce and how they intend to defend their product. And so the further into a life cycle with a piece of government equipment, the more likely you are to be hit with documents that show, oh yeah, we can enjoy immunity from any sort of liability. So that's a real high level view of some of the complexities of an Osprey case. But let me talk to you now about another case that David mentioned to you, and that was the 737 MAX litigation. The 737 MAX is a derivative of the Boeing 737 aircraft. And the 737 is a workhorse, has always been a workhorse. In fact, the 737-800 in a lot of circles is billed as the safest consumer aircraft ever. And they use a lot of different metrics for that. But generally speaking, the 737 is an extremely robust and reliable platform. Think of it as an F-150. Think of it as just some ubiquitous work piece of equipment, some tool that always works. It's always going to be reliable. It's going to work in the same way. And that's very, very important for pilots in the cockpit, that when you push a button, the plane responds the same way every time. You don't want surprises. You don't want surprises on takeoff or landing. You want to have reliability throughout. So in the late 60s, Boeing developed 737 aircraft. And since that time, 1967, since that time, there have been 13 or 14 or so variants or derivatives of the 737. They've widened it, they've lengthened it, they've made some other changes over the years, because aircraft are tailored specifically for routes. For example, you would not want a 747 flying back and forth between Montgomery, Alabama and Atlanta, because the passenger load, the demand just isn't there. And so they classify routes as short haul and long haul and medium and all those things. And so the 737 has developed over the years into a number of variants. Well, it's a huge cash cow, always has been for Boeing. In 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe, Boeing became aware that a company called Airbus is a European consortium of a couple of different companies, but it's a European group that manufactures aircraft to compete with everybody else. Airbus was coming up with something that was going to be the A320 family, and there are variants within that, A321, A321A. There are different variants in there, but the A320 family. One of the big things about the A320 was that it was brand new, literally brand new. It had something called LEAP engines. LEAP engines were 20% more fuel efficient. They were super quiet for flying into residential areas. They could fly further. They were more efficient in every way, and they had greater thrust. truly a leap forward in engine technology. In addition to that, the cockpit of the 320 was, think of a Tesla. It's all glass. It's all, you don't have the traditional buttons and knobs and things that you twist. It's all glass. It's a computer. And so this was a space age piece of equipment that was being built specifically to compete with the 737 to break into this market. And because it's so fancy, because it's so slick and efficient, they were really getting a lot of interest. And so Boeing sort of freaked out there for a little bit and said, listen, went around to its different buyers, airlines all over the world and said, look, we see, we hear what you're saying, but the 737, you've been flying this for years. All of your pilots know how to fly this, and your mechanics, your baggage loaders, all of the infrastructure, your spare parts, all of these things are tailored to the 737. If you change to this new plane, all of that has to change. All of your infrastructure changes, but the biggest thing you have to change is the training of your pilots, because they know how to fly the 737. This MAX, this 321, this Airbus plane is something entirely different. So here's what we'll propose to you. We would like to build you a brand new aircraft, and we're going to build it based on the 737, but we'll take those LEAP engines, those very same great LEAP engines, and we'll just put those on the 737. Now here's a model of a 737 MAX, okay? And one of the things you'll notice is the placement of the engines. And that's not something that jumps out at you unless you're in aviation or unless you're looking at one of these cases, but you see generally the engines are underneath the wing. Well, because the 737 was first designed in the late 60s, it was built very low to the ground, because in the 60s, baggage handlers literally had to be able to access the underbelly of the plane. You didn't have as much of the automated equipment that you have now. And so you needed to be able to get to stuff, to get your hands on things. Also, to be able to board the plane, you used to have to board it, and you still do in most of Africa, through a staircase mounted on the back of a pickup truck or a van or something that would drive outside to the plane, and you would just walk up the stairs to the plane. You didn't have the jetways. Everything was built low to the ground. Well, when they put these new LEAP engines, when the engineers tried to fit these new LEAP engines underneath the wing in the place that it had always been, which hung underneath, they discovered right away, well, we don't have enough clearance. We don't have any clearance down here for this. And so to solve that, they moved the engines, instead of low and back, they moved them forward and actually integrated up into the wing, so that if you're looking at it from this direction, you can see the engine actually humps up over the top of the wing here. It's actually integrated up into the wing. And then if you look a little bit closer at the bottom, the very bottom of the engine, you'll see that it's flat. You can see that, there you go, it's flat. And that's to give a little more clearance. That's because in takeoff and landing, this is a dynamic area. The takeoff and landing can move parts of this closer to the ground. So anyway, they changed all of that. Now, why does that matter? Here's why it matters. Let's get back to what we talked about earlier. Thrust and the center of gravity and the design makes a huge difference in the way a plane flies. You see, think about, I don't have a rocket model here, but think about a rocket. Think about a pin as a rocket. As long as it's got rocket fuel, propellant, being exhausted out the tail, it's going to go wherever the pointy end is pointing, because that's just the way the physics work. You got little bitty fins that will direct and affect some of the control, but it doesn't require lift. It requires thrust. Airplanes work off of a little bit of both. They have to have enough speed to go fast enough to generate lift over the wings. It's a principle that at a certain speed, at a certain angle, the air pressure underneath the wing is greater than the air pressure over. And because you have a low pressure area over the wing, you develop lift and you have flight. But the wings are vitally important for lift. Well, when the engineers developed the 737 MAX specifically to try to compete with the Airbus, and by the way, they were super, super successful at competing initially. They wrote 5,000 orders for the new planes, for the 737 MAX plane. And this was a plane that, depending on who you were, depending on how many you bought, these were 100 to 120 million, sometimes maybe more. But they would make package deals for friends and family, right? So very, very successful in selling these things. But when they made the changes, when they pushed the engine forward and up, they changed, remember, the thrust, where you're holding it, where you're letting it go, where you're giving it that principal direction of thrust for flight. They changed that. They also changed the center of gravity and the pivot point. So it changed the flight characteristics of the plane altogether. What happened was, when they did the tests in the 737 MAX early, they discovered that when it took off, it wanted to continue to climb at a pretty pronounced rate of climb. It wanted to continue to climb. And you think, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because a plane is not a rocket. A rocket can fly at any angle. A plane cannot. It can exceed what's known as a critical angle of attack. If it gets beyond a certain angle, the air is no longer passing over the surface of the wing. It doesn't develop lift. The engines are still pushing. The engines are still pushing as hard as they can, but the wings aren't developing lift. And when that happens, inevitably it will drop a wing and crash. And so, because it wanted to continue to climb based on this new configuration, the engineers said, okay, well, that's okay. We've got a fix for that. Here's our fix. We will design and install a new secret computer system. And again, remember how we got started. Did you ever have a computer that never failed? No, you haven't. And they haven't either. And so they designed this new computer system. It was going to be secret. It was going to work in the background. They didn't tell pilots. They didn't tell airlines. They didn't tell the FAA. In fact, they specifically kept the information out of all the manuals, all the training materials, all the certification materials. They kept it all secret. Here's what the system was to do. It's called MCAS, and that stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It's a real fancy way to say, look, when the plane gets pitched up too great, the computer is going to sense that, and it's going to kick in and push the nose over. Pilot won't ever have to do anything at all. It'll be running in the background. He won't have to do anything. Well, how does the plane know what orientation that it is from the ground? How does it know if it's this way or this way? How does the computer know that? On the nose of the plane, on both sides, in fact, the next time you get on a plane as you're boarding, look over to your left just below the cockpit windows, and you may see a little, looks like a fin or a vein that's sticking out the side, V-A-N-E, not V-E-I-N, sticking out the side of the plane. And it's this. Here's one off of a 737. It's this. You won't see this coffee can piece because this is inside the plane. This would be the flush outer body skin of the plane here. But what you might see is this. This little vein, this little fin rotates. All right. And as wind passes over that, it changes its angle. The sensors in here sense the angle and feeds that information back to the computer. And the computer says, okay, fine. Now we know the plane is flying this way or this way. It's all based on these. There's one on both sides. For some reason, the 737 MAX was designed to only read one of those sensors at a time. Doesn't make any sense today in retrospect, but at the time they thought it was a good idea. When the plane took off from Addis Ababa in March of 2019, headed down to Nairobi, as soon as they took off, the computer began to experience a failure, and it began to sense that the plane was pitching up too greatly. Now, remember, they're taking off. You have to pitch up to take off. You have to give speed to take off because you've got to generate the lift. Well, the computer began to read the vane angle and had a malfunction. Now, it wasn't like it should do. It wasn't looking at both of these to say, are these both the same? Do we have a problem? Because quite honestly, bird strikes can cause erroneous information, and bird strikes happen so often there's actually a name for it. It's called a bird strike, right? It's one of those things that happen. So you have to build redundancy in. Well, they didn't do that. So when they had a malfunction in the vane on one of the sides during that takeoff, the computer began to say, well, we're climbing too great. Let's push the nose over a little. The pilots feel that. They're trying to take off. They feel the nose come over, and they're like, did you do that? Did you do that? We don't know what happened here. They don't know what's going on. There's a warning light on the dash that is supposed to tell the pilots if there's a disagreement between the two angle of attack indicators. It's not hooked up in the 737 MAX initially. And so for about 6 minutes, when this flight took off from Addis Ababa down to Nairobi, the pilots are fighting with an unknown, unseen, uncontrollable, hidden computer system that is continually trying to adjust the angle of the plane. And as they're trying to pull back, it's fighting and pushing down, develops into more of a porpoise type maneuver. They call back for assistance. They need to return to the airport, and they begin to make their maneuvers around. Unfortunately, they had to continue to increase airspeed. They continue to try to fight for lift and altitude, but they crashed. And at the time of the crash, close to 600 miles an hour. And of course, there were very few recognizable aircraft parts. I went to that crash site in May, just about maybe 7 or so weeks after the crash. We were contacted and asked to come down to meet with a number of families. And there are still pieces everywhere. The pit and the crater that was created was maybe 40 feet deep, maybe a little more than that. And certainly no recognizable aircraft parts there anywhere. The cases are filed in Chicago, one of the first fights after we got the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder information. We start to learn, that this is the identical flight pattern to a crash that occurred 3 months before in Indonesia. The very same thing happened, again, with a brand new 737 MAX plane. Boeing and the FAA at that time are trying to convince everyone this is a safe aircraft. There's nothing wrong here. But we knew otherwise, and the facts were sort of bearing that out. So we were able to come up with an understanding of what happened, why it happened, and how it happened as a result of several years of work and investigation. And these cases are filed in Chicago in federal court. They are consolidated for the purposes of discovery, but each case will be tried individually. Some of the cases have settled over the 2 years now that they've really been working hard on these, but several more are set to begin trials, with the first to go to trial in March of 2023. In fact, depositions of some of the defense experts are taking place now. And I was back in Nairobi about 3 weeks ago, taking fact depositions of some of the damages witnesses, the family members of people who were at the airport that morning waiting for their family to come back, and how they learned about it and what happened and the process they've had to go through. So these cases are very active. They're set for trial in the coming year. And there's still a lot to be learned. Boeing, on a whole different track, pled guilty to a criminal charge to the Department of Justice, paid a $2 billion fine, and signed a deferred prosecution agreement in which Boeing admitted deceiving the FAA, deceiving the aviation community, lying and covering up, and having an aircraft that at some point they knew had problems and continued to lie about it. There have been fixes, there have been changes to the computer system, but the changes to the architecture of the aircraft, the location of the engines, how they're integrated into the wings, the thrust characteristics, the lift, all of that remains the same. Essentially, they've come out with a better Band-Aid. They've refined the computer system in hopes of preventing this again. And some of the 737 MAX variants have received certification and approval to start flying again. So they're actually starting back up with those now. So there's a lot to be said with those cases and a lot of time to cover. I could do a webinar and have actually on just the 737 MAX cases. I've got a number of other cases to talk about. I've got cases of civilian aircraft, smaller aircraft, where a doctor leaves Michigan, and we handled this one for a client up in Michigan not too long ago. Left Michigan going over to the New Jersey area for a fly-in. Fly-in is like a training exercise for aircraft owners. And because of a malfunction in his oxygen system, as he climbed out of the airport and switched over to his oxygen system, there was an incorrect air pressure sensor that failed and blew out all of his oxygen. If you look back over here, you can see a little green tank over my shoulder in the corner. That's a tank that was in one of these aircraft. It's in the tail. A failure in the oxygen regulating system blew out all of his oxygen out of the tail of the aircraft in 7 or 8 seconds. It should have lasted about 11 hours. But there was a failure, blew it all out. He became hypoxic and developed an anoxic brain injury. His plane continued to fly as he was at first asleep from hypoxia and then dead from the brain injury. Flew until it ran out of fuel and crashed a little over 6 miles off the coast of Atlantic City. That raised a whole other issue involving the Death on the High Seas Act, which is not something that you typically run into, but we had to extensively navigate the Death on the High Seas Act, because that's an act that, if they can, like the government contractor, if they can prove the elements that the death occurred on the high seas, this is a body of law that came about in the 1700s from sailing ships. You had a death on a ship somewhere off the Horn of Africa. You know, who's at fault? What law do you apply? What country is at issue? And so the Death on the High Seas Act came about. We were able to show, no, the death did not occur on the high seas. He wound up on the seas because he was dead from an anoxic brain injury that occurred from a failure of an aircraft component. So it was a very complex case that we were successful in, and one that I'm particularly proud of because of the complexities. I know that we're getting close to time now, and I've got tons that I could talk about. But David, if you're there, let me take a break and see if there's any questions that I can address or comments.
So Mike, as the host, if you'll allow me to join back in by video, I'd love to do that. We've still got a little bit of time. No, still can't rejoin, but hey, listen, on behalf of all our viewers, I want to thank you for really bringing us a very thoughtful and thorough presentation. And I don't want you to stop what you're doing. We still can go another 10 minutes or so to ensure that everyone gets full CLE credit. Let me do this. Let me pose this question to you, if you don't mind. And this question comes from William. William asked the question, in the 737 MAX crash, was the aircraft on autopilot?
It's a great question. And one of the things that people first think about is, well, why didn't the pilots just, flip a switch or click off the computer and make it safe, right? There you are. There you're back. Yeah, why don't you just turn off this system? Well, a couple things. One, it's not on autopilot. They're in the takeoff procedure. Looks like we've got another couple of questions coming in, but anyway, they're taking off. And so this is not an automated process. The pilots are very involved in what's going on, and they need to respond to things. But here's the bigger issue. The pilots don't know this system is even there. Think about a movie in which a terrorist is on board. He's got a laptop computer. He's somehow wirelessly accessed the aircraft's controls, and he is going to control the airplane. The pilots don't know what he's doing. They don't know that he's there. They don't know how he's doing it. That is exactly the situation that the pilots in Ethiopia were faced with. They did not know the system existed. They did not know what it did or how it did or what it was doing to the aircraft. The only thing they knew is that the aircraft is responding poorly. It is responding, erratically. It's not pulling up like it should. And so they're literally fighting with it the whole time. That was complicated by this whole notion that's put forth in the media by Boeing, by the way, and backed up by the FAA at the time. You see, when the first crash occurred off of Indonesia in December of 2018, Boeing came out very aggressively because, remember, they sold 5,000 of these things, 5,000 of these at $120 million. Pretty soon, that's some real money involved there, right? And so they're trying to protect a huge cash cow with this new product. So the first thing they came out with when the Indonesian crash occurred in the ocean, again, moments after takeoff, was, well, if this had been American trained pilots, if this had been US carriers, never would have happened. This is a bunch of foreign pilots who don't know what they're doing. They weren't trained appropriately. And so this is a robust, reliable airframe. There's nothing wrong with this aircraft. This was a pilot problem. The FAA picked up that song and dance and said, yep, we agree. We've looked at it. There's nothing wrong here. The problem is 3 months later, our crash, Ethiopian flight ET-302, identical flight profile, takes off and they fight it all the way to the ground. And only after that crash, and again, regulators around the world, the FAA is only the regulator in the United States. Each country has its own regulating board for aviation safety. Carriers around the world were pretty quick to recognize there's a problem. There's a real problem here. When you're losing close to 400 people in 2 crashes in 3 months in an aircraft that is brand new, literally brand new. And so what's the problem? So the regulators around the world began to ground it. The United States, even though we were the home of Boeing, who built these things, we were the last to ground these things. When we eventually grounded them, it resulted in the largest and longest grounding of a civil aviation plane in the history of aviation, ever in history. They were grounded that long because the problem is that serious. So that's a lot to say, no, you couldn't just switch off autopilot because there's so many things going on. And you got to remember too, these pilots are under a tremendous workload. They expect things to operate the same way every time. We don't have to go back and do these things and fix these things. So let's see another question here. Does a Harrier jump jet have the same issues as a V-22 Osprey? No, it doesn't. And here's why. The Harrier, let me take my little Osprey model. So the Harrier, if I can pop it off, the Harrier uses something called ducted thrust, all right? It's got a big central engine and it's got these little nozzles underneath. It doesn't have, here, let's just tell you what we'll do. We'll pull these propellers off so they don't distract us. It doesn't have propellers, it's a jet. And it vectors, it points the thrust of the jet engine down at the ground. And because of that, it rises on a column of thrust. And then once it's up in the air, it can change the direction of that vent and begin to move it forward. So the Osprey accomplishes it with rotating the engines themselves. So you don't have the number of rotating parts, you don't have the vibration problems, you don't have any of those same issues. You've got a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft in a Harrier, the jump jet, but you don't have this. I see another question. Where was your DOSA case, which was the death on the high seas, and did the court rule in favor on your DOSA issue? Yes, this case was in state court in Michigan. And by the way, for any of these issues that we've talked about, any aircraft, anything that we've investigated or briefed, anything that I can help you with at any point, I encourage anybody to reach out to me individually. I am glad to share briefs and theories and experts and just talk through anything that you might have run across. But to answer this question, yes, ultimately we were successful on the death on the high seas issue. It took a number of medical examiner depositions, and to complicate that, the death on the high seas is what you think it is. Did a death occur on the high seas? Well, when they brought the aircraft out of the ocean that occurred in that case, that was a Mooney aircraft. When they brought it up out of the ocean, he had been down for 2 or 3 days. The medical examiner in New Jersey does an autopsy immediately because his body is really beginning to go through some pretty advanced decomposition. And there's no tox issues, and there's no other really blatant issue that jumps out at her. So she says blunt force trauma. So we have a death certificate that actually says he died of blunt force trauma in a crash on the high seas. So you think, how in the world do you get around that? Well, we discovered this information obviously a year or so after that. We had to go back to the medical examiner and basically say, look, here's the new information. Had you had that at the time, would that have affected your opinions? And she said, well, obviously that would have affected it, because she knew about hypoxia and anoxia and the effects on that. And there have been lots of discovery and training and research over the years of oxygen on pilots and the effect of that. And so it took a number of hearings, a number of depositions, very, very hard fought issue, and we did prevail on that.
Mike, let me ask you a couple of questions that occur to me, and I apologize. I'm a layperson. One of the fun parts about hosting these webinars is I get to hear from my partners, my friends who are discussing issues that I'm not familiar with, and of course, our law degrees are really nothing more than a license to learn. So I always learn something from these talks. And one question I have is this. So take us through the typical case investigation timeline. I mean, once those first responders and FAA investigators do their work in and around a crash site, when do you as a plaintiff's attorney gain access to the scene, to witnesses, to other records, all of the things that go into making a successful case?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unlike a car wreck, you can't always have immediate access to the wreckage because the insurance companies around the country have regional yards where we're used to having a salvage yard or a wrecking yard, a bunch of them in your city. Aircraft salvage yards, they exist, but they're not everywhere. They're sort of regional. One of the ones in the Southeast for us is just outside of Atlanta. And so typically crashes will be aggregated and held there till the FAA can come in and do their investigation. And they bring in typically the manufacturer of the engine, and they'll have teardowns, and you really aren't party to that. They keep out plaintiff's lawyers, they keep out the outsiders, and they're trying to, at that point, establish a technical reason. And they do that for a couple of reasons. They want to find out what happened here, but they also want to know if there's an endemic problem with a model. If something, for example, is a fatigue crack that's developing over the number of flight hours because of rotation or because of metallurgy or whatever it is, exposure to salt water, they want to know if you should go back and develop a more robust and rigorous and shorter inspection timeframe, right? And so eventually those items are cleared and released, and you have to be hyper vigilant at that point because the insurance company wants their money back out of the salvage. And they will immediately sell and salvage that, and you can lose those parts. And so as soon as we are contacted, we put those places that we know of on notice if you have the wreckage, and put a litigation hold on it. We try to go the day or sooner thereafter that we can, that it's released, with an expert if we can, and try to start putting together what has happened. Now, before that, we look at publicly sourced radar data sites that we can pull up. We can get a lot of information from, was the plane on an erratic course, for example? Was the plane's altitude changing dramatically? Was there weather in the area? Were there birds in it? Were there other aircraft in the area? And so we have a good idea before we go look at the wreckage. But the way the wreckage has failed, the way certain parts have failed, can tell you whether or not they were in rotation when they were impacted. Did they leave a certain witness mark? Did they have torque or rotational damage? Is there still fuel in all of the lines? Was there continuity between the flight control, the yoke, and the pieces in the back of the plane that are supposed to be moving? Is the line still connected? And so, initially at least, it's making sure we have our arms around all of the data and all of the components and all of the wreckage, so that we can begin to put the puzzle pieces back together. Animations are huge, obviously, in these, because again, the concepts can be complicated, and it's difficult to understand all this until you can see it. Here's a great question. I want to move to this. The incestuous relationship between the FAA and Boeing. My question is there just too much money at stake for the FAA to vigorously regulate the U.S. aviation industry? And talk about a topic we could talk about for hours on.
Let me interrupt you and ask you, Mike. I mean, where does the typical FAA investigator come from?
Well,
are they former industry executives, engineers?
It's even worse when you talk about the 737 MAX, because there's a program in the aviation regulation and certification industry known as ODA, and it's Organization Designation Authority or something like that. But what it stands for, what it means, is we're not going to have an FAA guy, whatever that is. We're not going to have the government guy come in. We're just going to have a Boeing employee act as an FAA guy. And by the way, he's still on the Boeing payroll. He still gets a Boeing bonus. He still gets a check. And his job is to go over and look at it and go, this all looks pretty good to me. Well, what is he going to say if he finds a problem? If he finds a problem in a plane in which there are 5,000 orders and they're $120 million a piece, you think a guy who's making $60,000, $80,000 a year is going to say, I think I need to exercise my authority here and put a halt to this and bring this to a stop? No, that doesn't happen. And that didn't happen. That did not happen. In fact, it affirmatively went the other way, and it was covered up. So the relationship between the FAA and the airline industry, not just Boeing, but aviators in general, is very complex. It is incestuous in a lot of ways. These same companies are big in outer space research, and so there are national security implications here. And so you get into this whole: are they too big to fail? We can't allow a defense contractor, because think of all the satellites, think of all the war equipment that these companies make. We can't allow them to go bankrupt, and so we have to protect them at some level. And so it is incestuous is an excellent way to refer to that. It can be secretive, and because it can be secretive, it can be corrupted, and frequently is corrupted. And the losers are us, the flying public. Anybody, people who aren't even in these planes, can be affected, because planes can crash into anything. I've said, look, I'm not going to fly on a 737 MAX, because again, it's just a safer Band-Aid at this point. What if you've made the decision not to fly on it, but then you get to the gate and your airline has said, well, we had an equipment problem with our other plane, we're going to bring a new one around? Everybody who's flown has heard that at some time or another. how do you know what you're on now? And you don't really. So that just underscores why this stuff has to be done right the first time, every time. And there's no room for the corruption and you know, and greed that you see in this.
Well, Mike, I can't thank you enough for the time you put into this presentation. I know that all of our viewers have enjoyed it. And for those of you who may have missed our earlier announcements, by the end of this week, you'll receive an email with a certificate of attendance, an evaluation form, and an updated presentation and video link. You can email your completed evaluation form to webinars@beasleyallen.com. Again, for those of you who are participating by phone, please email us your name, phone number, and state bar ID number to webinars@beasleyallen.com to ensure you receive full CLE credit. Also, be sure to check out the events page of our website, beasleyallen.com/events, as we're going to be adding more webinars throughout the coming year. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to everyone for supporting our Beasley Allen webinar series. Thanks and have a good day.